Hi, and welcome back to the second episode of the story of my journey. If you haven't listened to the first episode yet, I would suggest you go back and do that. Otherwise, I'm just gonna pick up where I left off. So, here we go. After stabilizing her enough for a couple of hours, it was time to move her from the old part of the hospital to the new. Luckily, I was in good enough shape to be discharged from their care and just receive some follow-up care in connection to the neonatal unit. So we all could be in the same place. We got transported through the underground culvert, my daughter in an incubator and me in a wheelchair. She was taken to an ICU room and I was taken to a post-delivery patient room. In front of us laid the unknown. Would she make it? Would we, at the end of this journey, go home with our daughter? Only time could tell. After getting a couple of hours of sleep, we went to visit our daughter. We were about to step into this whole new world. A world with so many machines, parameters, measurements, rules, tests, procedures, cords, appliances, doctors, nurses. They measured her SATs, blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide, blood gas, among other things, continuously or regularly. Her body was covered in electrodes, CVCs, PVCs for the IVs, pulse oximeter, and a tiny, tiny diaper. Her face was covered with a CPAP and the cap that it attached to, patches that protected her skin from the strings of the CPAP, feeding tube, and most times when she wasn't examined, she was swaddled up in a nest with something covering her eyes, with arms the size of my pinky and the legs the size of my index finger. She had a pacifier that looked like it belonged to a doll. And all of this took place inside an incubator that held a higher temperature and humidity. The incubator was also covered with a blanket to minimize all impressions of sound and light to imitate the conditions of the uterus as much as possible. A baby born this early is so fragile and sensitive. Every time I entered the ICU, I had to wash my hands and arms up to my elbows with soap, and after that, apply disinfectant. And I was in and out of that room a lot. I wasn't allowed to stroke her, as her skin was so fragile that the strokes would be rather inflicting pain than giving love and affection. So I stood still for hours with my arms through the holes of the incubator, with my hands on top of her so that she could feel my presence, since I wasn't allowed to hold her. Through these holes, all ordinary baby tending was done as well, like changing diapers and so on. There were monitors everywhere in the room, beeping and alarming back and forth. There were so many new things to learn. For each measurement, what was good, what was bad, and what was really bad. Many things didn't have an exact answer either. SATs are one of those. SATs stand for oxygen saturation in the blood. A healthy young adult has SATs around 97%. And everything above 90 is acceptable for a premature baby. With this information, I saw our baby girl's SATs going down to 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20 at times, and sometimes often with a variety of reactions from the medical staff. Eventually, I gathered that it's the long-term effect of low SATs that are detrimental, but with these alarms going off all the time, initially my nervous system reacted as if she was about to die every time. Dazed and confused with the whole situation, I was also to get my milk production going. I squeezed and squeezed my breasts until I finally got some of that colostrum out of them. It was a proud moment. I so deeply desired to help her in some way, and to get my natural milk that was designed for her felt pretty darn good. I grew melonas overnight, but unfortunately, I also had an inflammation in them, causing me to feel feverish and under the weather. But at least the milk was flowing. I had a breast pumping machine that I used every third hour. For each pumping session, I had to get sterile disposable appliances and cups. I had to sit in the room for at least 15 to 20 minutes to run the program. And after that, I had to label the bottle and walk over to the milk kitchen, which had a dedicated staff member to just handle all of the mother's milk. They made sure that abundant milk was put into the freezer and everything was labeled correctly and given to the right child at the right time in regards to their current consumption. These golden drops were not going to waste. This I did 8 times a day, which equals around 4 hours a day combined. The first few days of getting familiar with everything made me feel more and more like a medical assistant rather than a mother. There wasn't much interaction or closeness with her. The days were spent being a milk cow, sterilizing myself and everything all the time, doing as much of the taking care as possible with diapers, temperature checks, and so on, trying to keep up with morning rounds and all its terminology, trying to ask the impossible questions. Will she make it? When will we know if she will make it? How is she doing? The questions never really had any answers, more so stories of experience, telling me that this is one of the most unpredictable roller coasters you can be on. One minute, everything can seem to be fine, and then the next, everything goes sideways. Usually, this roller coaster has its up and downs, but one thing is for certain, that it will contain both. And it felt as if I held my breath through it all. The first week is many times considered to be the honeymoon phase. Even though she was born so early, initially she was sometimes even breathing room air. In other words, she had the CPAP settings to 21% oxygen and was just getting the support from the pressure of the air getting into her lungs so that she would save her energy and not have to breathe entirely on her own. She was doing so good that they even started talking about letting me hold her, even before she was 1 week old. I had barely got a good look at how she looked, just catching a glimpse between changing the CPAP nosepiece. Even less got to hold her. And suddenly the moment came. I was about to hold my own daughter for the first time. One might think that that must have been the most precious moment, which of course it was. Yet again, I felt as if I could actually do something for her other than being a milk provider. This concept is called kangaroo care, and our session of skin to skin contact between newborns and parents. And it has been shown to improve the physical and neurological health for premature babies. These sessions lasted at least 3 hours at a time for them to give more than they took from her. Just moving her was basically putting her through yet another trauma. But as long as it was done for at least 3 hours, the pros outweighed the cons. It was a precious moment indeed, but it was also filled with nervousness and worry. What if something would happen while she is in my care in this way? What if I clamp any of the tubes or cords? What if I fall asleep and accidentally move and drop her? What if, what if, what if? Besides all those racing thoughts, it was a beautiful moment of having her where she belonged, where she was supposed to be, with me, on me, close to me. Not with acrylic glass between us, not with people watching my every move over my shoulder. Just me lying in a bed with my daughter on my chest, and for her to have her mother gently humming lullabies for hours. I also quickly realized that I wasn't really remembering any lullabies. So Brahms' lullaby and a Swedish one called Byssan Lull had to do it. I finally started to get the hang of it all. I knew all the terminology. I knew roughly within what span we wanted her to be for each parameter. Her need for extra oxygen was going up and down as expected, but in general, many of the exams were going her way. She had during this time been through more ultrasounds on her brain and heart. Her heart was having some difficulty closing the ductus, which is a blood vessel that is formed during fetal growth. While in the womb, fetal circulation lets blood flow straight from the aorta to the pulmonary, going around the lungs. It's normal for a newborn to have an open ductus, but it's supposed to close at least within a few days. For a premature baby, it puts a great strain on the entire system if it's open, which was the case for Greta. To begin with, they approached it with a non-invasive treatment, but if it didn't close, she would need surgery. Even though she had difficulties and was still very tiny and fragile, she was at this point considered to be the most healthy baby in this neonatal unit. We were in the one hospital in Sweden that takes care of the smallest and sickest babies. They had to make room for even tougher cases than Greta's was at that point. In other words, we had to change hospitals. And as it happens, there are sometimes swift and quick decisions when it comes to these kinds of things. All of a sudden, we had to be on our way. This felt like a really big blow since we just got into it all. We had gotten to know the staff a little bit better and knew our way around the facilities. Each day has 3 shifts with new people coming all the time. Since we never left the hospital, there were so many new faces all the time. And many people also include many directives. So when I finally got the hang of something in the care of Greta, there was a new person telling me to do things differently than the other person that taught me this thing to begin with. So just the idea of starting over with an entirely new medical staff pool at a new hospital with new directions and practices had me stressed out. Not to mention the anxiety of transporting my fragile baby girl not only through an underground culvert, but in an ambulance, on a road, with other cars, with the slamming of car doors, and all other stimuli that would be necessary to make it happen. But we had no choice. The rules of the game said she was out, so out she went. And in this way, I could keep going, describing every day of terror, of new exams, of procedures, how her heart kept struggling and underwent dozens of ultrasounds, how her brain underwent dozens of ultrasound that showed signs of potential issues, how her lungs struggled day in and day out to keep her body alive, how her eyes struggled with the constant addition of the extra oxygen, causing her eyes to develop ROP, also known as retinopathy of prematurity, which is just what caused Stevie Wonder's blindness. How her tummy struggled on a daily basis to accept and digest food. Her tummy that swelled into a balloon that got us rushed back to the hospital where we first resided for an emergency surgery. How they had to put her on a ventilator for the first time. And how all her vitals ticked down to zero right in front of my eyes. I thought I was losing her. I froze. Didn't dare to make a sound while the team of maybe 6 people worked on her. It turns out her vocal cords had spasmed, and it was until she was totally out that it loosened its grip and they got the ventilator going. All these moments of thinking I would lose her, over and over again. Like that time I was tending to her by myself, and all of a sudden she turns blue. Similar situations had happened before, but this time was different. I did all the tricks I had learned. I rubbed her back firmly to stimulate her body into remembrance of that breathing is necessary. Only this time, nothing worked. I yelled to the nurses that quickly pressed the big button. They force started her breathing again with this neo-puff resuscitator. Yet again, another traumatic incident. With an arrow drawn on her skin to point out where the incisions was to be made, we sat in a meeting with the surgeon that told us what was about to happen when she got a call from the chief physician that said that we were to hold back the surgery and undergo a series of x-rays with an injectable dye to see the flow through the intestines in search of any blockages or obstructions. Only to ourselves get sick with the stomach flu and having to leave her at the hospital alone. Not allowed back until 72 hours after the last symptom. It was absolutely heartbreaking. So her grandmothers came to the rescue and continued the kangaroo care. Some grief surfaced around not being able to be present for the first time my mother got to meet my child. All these little sorrows throughout this whole process. That at the end of the day doesn't matter as long as she was alive. But nothing about this whole process had been as I had dreamed of since I was a little girl. I never got to feel her kicks inside of me, never got to breastfeed her, never got to hold her properly until she was a couple of months old. Being more of a medical staff than a mother, I had to brace myself in order to cope with the intensity the fragility, the longevity, and the uncertainty of the whole situation and process. As humans, we are able to cope with traumatic situations for a period of time, but this protracted and traumatic experience was too much to handle. And in the midst of it all, I went through the normal motherhood things like healing from the pregnancy and childbirth, discharge, hormones going in all directions, struggles with pumping and the flow of the milk. Usually, when breastfeeding, it's a constant biological feedback loop between the mother and a child, and how much milk is to be produced through prolactin, which is the lactation hormone. When you don't have that closeness to your child, when the breasts are pumped through a machine instead, that hormone isn't triggered as naturally and eventually fades. I felt like such a failure when my production started to go down. The content of the milk was also examined in a lab in order to determine how much fat, protein, and so on it contained. So all these otherwise natural elements between a mother and a baby all became sterile and all a numbers game. In addition to the extremely stressful and clinical environment that we already were in. During these 15 weeks at the hospitals, there were a lot of families coming and going. Some end up in the neonatal care for a day, some for a week, and some a lot longer. With the utmost respect and compassion for these people, there were a lot of them saying after being there for a couple of days, "We are finally going home on Sunday." Which kind of triggered me because I could never say the same. We had been there for so many weeks and still had no idea when we were going home. During these times, we slept on a fold-out couch, had access to half a shelf in a refrigerator, and with no possibility to cook anything. I know that we in Sweden are blessed to be able to stay at the hospital 24/7 with our children in the NICU, but there's an aspect of the totality of the discomfort for the nervous system that gets amplified with these somewhat petty discomforts of the day-to-day conveniences. There wasn't much space to tend to your own needs, and the constant microwave food didn't add to that experience. So the times some of our friends and family came with home-cooked meals are cherished in my heart forever. Unfortunately, no one was allowed to visit at the hospital where we stayed the longest. Oddly enough, we were allowed visitors at the first hospital, where they had the sickest and smallest children. But since we were only there during the most critical times, only a handful of our closest family came there. This was also a sorrow, to have this child but not be able to share her with the world, with my people. As the days, weeks, months went on, her roller coaster journey continued. She had had around 4 rounds of antibiotics, most often for unknown infections. But for each infection, they ran all the tests: blood, urine, scan, x-rays, you name it, they did it. But most of the time came up short in terms of finding the root cause. So every time they treated her with this broad spectrum, very strong antibiotic that had to be administered intravenously 4 times a day. This very strong medicine ruptured her blood vessels and thereby busted the PVCs every time. So for each time, they also had to set a new PVC. They tried to vary the places where they put them, but most of the time the option was in a foot, hand, or her head. She looked like and still looks like a pincushion from all her scars. And even though the nurses are specialized in working with these small children, even they struggle a lot to get the PVCs into these extremely small children. They most often tried to choose the most experienced and skilled nurse that was on that shift, but when even they failed at times, they had to call on specialists from the surgical department. So my little girl was stung hundreds of times when counting both the successful and the unsuccessful attempts. And I was by her side through them all. And the PVCs wasn't just needed for the medicine. Many times she needed blood transfusion, nutrition, vitamins, and so on. There was this one day, day 78 of our neonatal stay, that is stuck in my memory a little extra. It was the day when she went from having high flow oxygen mask to a low flow oxygen mask. Up until this point, she had been on first CPAP, then ventilator, back to CPAP, high flow oxygen mask, and then now the low flow. The ventilator does all the work for you, the in and out breath. The CPAP provides one constant pressure of air to help with not needing to do all the work of breathing. All these devices required machines that meant that she was stuck to the wall. Until now. With the low flow, we were able to carry with us an oxygen tank in a backpack. So I prepared a baby sling and put her in it, and we took our first walk. It was just a short walk down the hall to one of the hospital's balconies, but to me, it was a taste of freedom. I'm a person that values my freedom a lot, and throughout this whole process, I had felt kind of stuck in my body throughout the difficult pregnancy, stuck at the milking station, sucking the life of my boobs, stuck in the hospital, in the NICU, in our room. It might be frowned upon to talk about my feelings and needs in this situation, since the main thing that matters was, of course, my daughter's well being. But to be able to tell my story, I have to tell you all of it. So, this little taste of freedom, even if it was just a walk down a hall, meant the world to me. I could also, for the first time, hold her a bit more properly. Before, there was a big plastic tube that always weighed heavily on her face, and it was nearly impossible to hold her yourself. You had to have someone to assist you in taking her up from her bed. So the luxury of being able to pick her up was indescribable. We even got an extension cord so we could take naps in our bed together. Eventually, we even progressed to stroller walks outside, off campus, in the spring sun. Those were magic for my soul. We had gotten a bugaboo donkey stroller that had a perfect side basket that fit the oxygen tank perfectly, and the pulse oximeter that measure the oxygen saturation, I hid next to her. So to anyone that passed us, we were just a normal mom and baby having a normal stroller walk. That feeling got me through the last weeks of our stay. I want to do a general shout out, obviously, to all staff that ever took care of Greta and the facilities that she was in. But there is a special person that comes to mind in regards to the previous story. That is Caroline. She was one of Greta's rounding neonatal doctors, and she was also one of her heart specialists. She was so special to me because she always did that little extra effort that meant so much to me. She was the one that pushed through and made our first walk through the hallway happen. She was the one that fought tooth and nail to get us the twin room, even though we didn't have twins, just so we could have a little bit of extra space since we had been there for so long. Even though when we first moved there, we had to leave due to another doctor's directives. But when Caroline came back and found out about this, hell broke loose and we were right back where she thought we belonged, in the bigger room. She was the one that always called my daughter the Great Greta. She made us feel special, and for that I'm forever grateful. There are so many more I could mention, but I will just make one more short shout out, and that is to her current doctor, Björn, that has been with Greta since she was 2 weeks old and will follow her until she is 18 years old. He has always made us feel so safe, and no matter the issue or feeling, he has always taken the time and made the effort to make us feel heard and seen. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you to all of you who saved my daughter's life, cared for her and our whole little family during those trying times. We could have never done it without you. And all of a sudden, after all those setbacks, with infection after infection, things were falling into place. The feeding tube was gone, and she had learned to take the bottle. We were taking care of her and her meticulous medical schedule mostly on our own. We'd been given all the proper training with infant CPR and everything else we needed to know. So finally, we got the word. We were going home. With the oxygen tank, low flow oxygen pulse oximeter, and home care, though, which was totally okay as long as we could leave. After 101 days in the neonatal care, on the actual original due date, with her weighing even over 3 kilos, which is approximately 6.6 pounds, we were finally home. We unfortunately got a little bad news as a send off. They had discovered a hernia that needed surgery, which she had a month later. It was difficult to go back to the hospital environment so soon, and scary to give such a small baby anesthesia. But everything went fine, and nothing could take away the joy of her being out of the woods and for her to be home where she belonged. I don't know how we all made it, but she did, I did, we did. Thank you so much for listening to this part 2 of my story. Hopefully, you will come back for the third and final episode. Until next time.